Good morning, Aaron. How you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic, Dave. How are you?
I'm doing super duper amidst embracing and even as we do the podcast, I have storm shutters on my office windows to protect us from the hurricane winds and anything that might decide to become airborne in the process. But you know, cranking along, getting used to living in Florida. I think about everywhere you live. In Indiana, there's tornado season.
Yep.
Down in Florida here, there's hurricane season. So you just gotta no matter where you live, there's always some kind of weather event that's challenging. But anyway, today we're going to talk a little bit about conflict resolution within family members in business together, and I thought that this is a large component of what I end up doing as I consult and coach family-owned businesses, and I thought it'd be a fantastic topic for us to get into today.
Yeah, I agree. And, it's a topic that it wasn't immediately obvious to me. In the last episode,
Mm.
when we were talking about repairing trust and relationships, and you had mentioned conflict as a mechanism through which that we can start to establish safety and trust with the people that are within a family business. And when you first said that, I was a little bit taken aback because I typically think of conflict as something that has the potential to be destructive. And since the
Mm.
last episode to this episode, I mean, you definitely have me sold at this point. That I've been thinking about it, and I believe that you're right. But upon initially hearing it, I was just sort of I didn't know what to think. I had to stop and pause for a second.
Well, there are a rare few folks in this world who don't shy away from conflict, and they drive right into the center, into the eye of the storm. All puns intended today, but those are a rare few. I think in general, most folks are conflict avoidant to some level or another, and really fear the outcome of conflict and the potential bad outcomes in particular. And so oftentimes when I get folks in coaching, folks have maybe tried to resolve the conflicts in the best ways they know how, maybe even tried to resolve them by avoiding them or hoping they'll just go away. But issues are issues and they fester if we don't attend to them, and they get worse over the course of time, whether you're in a couple's own business or a family business, a general family business. And so it's important to attend to the conflict. And the nice thing, I think your response is probably a real normal one that most folks, when they think about conflict, immediately go, "Oh no, that's going to be disastrous." And sometimes conflict can be. One of the things, I don't know how far we'll get today, but there's a strategy for conflict resolution. You could probably find anything like that online. But there's some secret sauce to it, to what I do, and that really kind of comes from my 36 years as a marriage and family psychotherapist. And without that secret sauce, I think conflict has much less of an opportunity to be productive. And with this secret sauce, some of the things I'll talk about today, and I'm going to go over a kind of a general outline of conflict resolution and how it works best. But then I'm going to add in the secret sauce components and the ways that I help really smooth things out, and also I know what to look for when things start to go the wrong way.
Well, that is So are you going to give us the whole recipe, or are you gonna just give us just enough to kind of get started?
Well, let's take a look at just a general outline that I use for most conflict situations or mediation situations, and that is we like to set the ground rules. And I'm a little bit different. I'm kind of a different duck, and I have kind of my own strategy and style about how to go about things. And so one of the things I like to do, folks oftentimes dread conflict, even if they've got somebody like me and we're coming together to try to resolve that conflict, they'll anticipate the worst outcomes, they'll anticipate the worst responses. And so I start off a little differently. So I begin, first we set the ground rules. We want to talk about confidentiality and respect, being open-minded, and trying to stay focused on a given particular topic. But I like to also start out with, because we're family, right? In these family businesses, also like to start out with some gold. I like to start out with some loving statements. And one the father son um, business that I did this with, I had them do some reminiscing. They had been in business together over 20 years, and they were father son, of course, as well. And so I just had each of them talk a little bit about what some of the cool things were about the early days in coming up in this business together. Father started it, son joined him, and so I got them reminiscing in some positive, loving ways towards each other. And so I like to start off with some kind of a memory, or some kudos, some nice things, loving things that you might be able to say to your family member, to get things rolling in the right way right off the bat.
Something that I find to be true is that meshes really well with is that I find that if we remember that we have a mutual goal, that we have a common goal,
Mm,
and the common goal shouldn't be how exactly we're going to do this one particular thing. The common goal should be larger. It should be that we
hmm
want the business to thrive, or it should be something that is more substantial like that. And then the other component is for everyone in the meeting to understand that there's some level of safety. So when you start
mm,
off the meeting with reminiscing about the positive elements and giving compliments, I think that fulfills a lot of what I try to do with letting everyone know that that this is not a conflict where we're removing somebody from the team, unless
mm.
it's that kind of meeting, and
Yes,
then that would
yes.
be a different conversation. But the majority of conflict is not that kind of thing. It's like we're on the same team. We want to remain on the same team, so let's just make that apparent up front. And I
Yes.
think that we get something is primal that's a part of us that no one wants to be banished from the tribe. So anytime that you feel like you might get banished from the tribe, your hackles go up and you're ready to defend. And it's not typically that type of situation. It's typically, no, you're a member of the tribe and you're here to stay, and we have a mutual goal. So if we can all have that established as a part of the game, the ground rules, then it's a lot easier to get rid of that fight or flight response and settle into a more productive way of thinking.
Yeah, and you said a really key word when you use the word safety, and I think that ultimately, and there's fantastic books written about this. You've read some of these as well as I have as well, and feeling safe is first and foremost the most important way to start a meeting. Maintaining the feeling of safety throughout the course of a meeting is really essential in that sense, in evading that fight or flight response like you're talking about.
And I had a little bit of an aversion to the word safety because I feel like it gets overused a little bit.
Mm,
And but it really is that. I mean, if
yes.
you don't feel, maybe if I remove the word safety and just insert something that is like, if you feel threatened, how do
Mm,
you not be defensive if you feel that there's a threat? So
yes.
it's like you
Yes.
have to be ready to defend if there's a threat. So the opposite of that is there is no threat. That this is a safe environment, that we're going to work through this together. And I think that that's really the only time that you can lower your defenses and start to access, honestly, access your prefrontal cortex. You're not really able to
Mm.
problem solve very well when you remain in that fight or flight mode.
Yeah, and that's one of the key pieces, some of the secret sauce that I'm going to talk about today. But that idea of feeling safe first of all, and when we don't feel safe or we feel threatened, as you say, we our hackles go up. You say, and we become emotionally flooded. And when that happens, different parts of the brain engage, and the prefrontal cortex is logically cordoned off. We don't have access to it because when there is a real threat, if there's a tiger in the woods nearby, and we don't want to sit and ponder or think or brainstorm. We want to move. Right, we want to take the right action to get to safety as soon as possible, and we don't want that feeling in a meeting. Right, that level of feeling of threat. We want to be able to maintain that feeling of safety. So one of the things I watch out for is emotional flooding. That sense of somebody starting to stare and not blink, somebody starting to sweat, somebody starting to get their tone starts to go up. All those signals that there's emotional flooding happening, and that when we're emotionally flooded in that way, we're really no good to the problem solving process.
I'm curious when you have a situation. I assume that the sooner that you catch this, the easier it is to start to uh, get it to change direction, or the easier it would be to restore safety. Are there any are there any ways? How do you go about restoring it? And is there a point where maybe it goes too far into emotional flooding and we got to take a step back, maybe even reschedule another meeting to let the emotions and the hormones that are coursing through our veins to let them all subside before we re-engage the conversation?
Yeah, once we're emotionally flooded and those stress hormones release, it takes about 20 minutes to really rid the body of those stress hormones. And so it's not a fast process, but the earlier we catch the process, the easier it is to get recentered. And I'll sometimes pause a meeting, have folks close their eyes, do some slow abdominal breathing. It's just one of the things I do. Or I'll retell a story that was told to start the meeting off, to regender that sense of connection that was there at the onset, and be able to try to get back to that, or sometimes a combination of those things, so that if we catch it quickly, we can usually continue in the meeting. If it escalates and gets worse, then sometimes we do have to pause the meeting and reschedule for a time that's better for everybody involved.
I have some questions that I kind of want to backtrack on, and
Mm,
hopefully, maybe you can help tie everything together in a linear fashion at the end of this episode. But you had
okay.
mentioned something in the very beginning that I think is really relevant, and that is maintaining the focus of the conversation. And from my
Yes.
perspective, focus can go awry in a couple different ways. It's not conducive for a constructive conversation. So could you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, and enter in the four horsemen of the apocalypse. It's the four areas where folks usually in families or in couples they'll usually get in trouble, and that is defensiveness, criticism, stonewalling, and contempt. And so that's another thing I keep a watch for in a conflict resolution meeting or mediation session. I take a look for those four horsemen, as we call them. And as they begin to come up, I redirect or I'll check back in with somebody. Maybe I'll do some relaxation and centering pieces with them. Or I'll check in about that emotion and see if I can get to the core of that emotion and where it's coming from. The other piece that sometimes gets in the way, you use the word focus, and focus is super important in a conflict resolution meeting, with family members in a business together. And so usually when things have gone wrong with a couple or in a family in business together, it's easy to say, and I know the research in marriages is that couples will have stuff go wrong for about 7 years before they ever reach out for help. And so we don't have that same research in families in general, or families even in business together. But I can guesstimate, right, that it's probably about the same thing, that some things have gone wrong for a long period of time, and that it's not just one thing that goes wrong. There's a whole handful of things. And so one of the things about focus when I get into a meeting is it will clearly define the problem that we are going to talk about, and then I'll share my commitment to really staying on that particular topic. I'll warn about what I call stacking. So because sometimes we get revved up a little bit, we start to become a little bit emotionally flooded, and then those other issues, those satellite issues, all start to come into mind, right? And folks will then want to have a tendency to build the fire bigger and bigger, and stack issues one on top of the other. And when I see that beginning to happen, I'll stop and say, you know what, we may need an additional meeting just for that topic, but today we're talking about X. And my commitment to you today is to have us stay focused on X until we get to the right kind of resolution.
It's so easy. In a sales conversation, I call those red herrings, where
Mm.
it's not really, it's really just taking you off the path. But it's hard when you're trying to come to a resolution on one specific problem, but then another problem gets brought into the fold. And it could be something as simple as, see, that's just like you, Dave, to do that, to, like, and then you want to address that, like, because you feel like you were attacked on a different front. Now you feel like you want to defend that other front, but really it it starts to get into a tangled mess that is almost impossible to untangle that knot when you start, like, hitting on too many things. So, yeah, I think that having that focused ground rules from the beginning of, we're on the same team here, we have the same ultimate goal, and this is
Yes.
the particular problem that we're trying to solve, and just relentlessly reminding ourselves about that as we go throughout the conversation. And any red herrings that come up, recognize that, ooh, that's stung a little bit, but we can address that in a different conversation, because if I start chasing these things, we're not going to solve any problems, not even the one that we showed up to
Yeah.
solve.
And that directly flies in the face of some of the advice you get as when I used to do psychotherapy, even as I got training back in 2004 for coaching. There's always um, this encouragement to follow the lead of your client.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you happen to be a helping professional, a coach or a therapist listening to this today, you may remember that advice. But in specific conflict resolution meetings or in specific mediation meetings, we don't want to do that. We want to do, Aaron, what you said here just now. We want to stay as focused as possible, so that we get to a good possible resolution for the problem in our meeting.
So you might have to help me get back on track here. So we have the focus of the meeting. We have that we are restoring safety and trust. And, when things start to go a little bit awry, there has to be a decision made as to whether or not we can restore that in this meeting, or whether or not we need to postpone the conversation. What other
Yes.
things do we need to think about after we have established trust and we're.
Well, we have to let me talk a little bit about the structure of the meeting in general. I first started out talking about the ground rules, talking about confidentiality and having respectful conversations and having open mindedness, and then we move on to define the problem. Right? We talk, maybe if there's two family members in a meeting, each person will talk about and identify and define the problem according to the way they see it, and then we'll gather those perspectives in as whole a way as we possibly can, so that understanding is possibly the best. In defining the problem, it's oftentimes important to try to stay away from blame. I'll have folks use I statements or talk about the issue and how it impacts them, instead of use statements and kind of the pointing of the finger to the other person. So blame doesn't really get us anywhere, nor does righteousness. We sometimes want to get righteous in our stance, and so sometimes I'll ask folks in a fun way, and yet confrontive way at the same time. Do you want to be right, or do you want to have reconciliation? Do you want to be right or reconciled? And because you have a choice right now about one or the other. So identifying the problem, getting clear about it, trying to gather each person's perspective, increase understanding, and at the same time try to avoid blame. In the process, we use a lot of active listening skills, paraphrasing, statements of empathy, trying to get in the other person's shoes and experience the situation from the opposite side of the spectrum. We try to avoid interruptions, and to be able to listen well, and listen until the person is finished with the presentation of their perspective of a problem. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Um, how often do you have? So what I hear you describing is us trying our very best to be open-minded and receive their full story.
Yes.
How much coaching do you do, or maybe this isn't an element, you'll have to let me know. I find that if I think about the story that I'm telling in my head before I go into the conversation, and I try to tell that story in as generous a way as possible for the other person,
Mm.
that I find that it's much easier for me not to go into a defensive place. So, for
Yes.
example, something could happen and I don't really know why that happened. It annoys me, it aggravates me, but I could start telling stories about how make basically casting the other person as a villain. Like they did this on purpose. They knew that that was going to
Mm.
bother me. They.
Mm.
And if I sit back and really just think about the facts and reconstruct these facts in a way that is as generous as possible for the other person, that allows me to enter the conversation in a way that is a lot easier for me to stay open minded about their story.
Yeah, yeah, and so it's almost like you're working hard to assume the best about the other person as you think about the telling of the story and when you sit down to do that.
Yes, because I don't really know what reality is. I only know what my my lens on the world. So if I'm going to assume that that's true, then why don't I take the version of reality that's most likely to get us to a positive outcome? So
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
I just give them the benefit of the doubt, and sometimes it's hard because you're aggravated. So you got to retell it in a way that is less
yes,
aggravating based on just the facts that you know and not make any assumptions about why until you get into
yes.
the conversation with the other person. They can tell you why.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. Well, and I think that that's really a great perspective. I like that a lot. And with active listening, this is a little more secret sauce, right? I find, and this is not talked about in the literature at all, that I'm aware of. Um, I find that one of the biggest obstacles, to listening actively and reflecting accurately is the fear of the listener that if I listen well, the other person will assume I agree with them.
Mm.
And so there's almost a resistance that happens inside somebody, if they were to say something like, "I can understand how you would feel that way," is a beautiful empathizing statement of understanding. But somebody might hold back from saying that. They might feel like they want to say it, but they're afraid. They want to listen to the other person while at the same time, holding their ground, still holding on to their same opinion. And so I often just say that out loud in a meeting. I'll say, it's okay to listen well, and it doesn't mean that you agree, it means that you understand. and that oftentimes opens the gateway for folks to have more empathy statements and active listening skills being used in the meeting. Is as long as they know if they listen well, the other person doesn't automatically assume that they agree with them.
That's a fantastic point. I mean, just reflecting on conversations that I've had, different conflicts that I've had, it, if I don't feel understood, it's hard for me to put the megaphone down. It's like, no, you're not getting it. You're not understanding. So if the other person does actually understand what I'm saying, and they let me know that they understand, and not just saying that they understand, but articulating it back to me in a way that I'm like, okay, yeah, you get it. Okay, I don't have to, I can put the megaphone down. You clearly received the message. And then we can move on to something more productive. But if you got the message and I don't feel like you got it, I could get stuck and just wanting to not let this point go.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And so it's tricky, isn't it? It can be super tricky, but if navigated well, like in some of the ways we're talking about here right now, can really lead to fantastic resolution, and a better understanding of each other in the family, and a deeper level of acceptance of the other person. Again, maybe they don't agree right at the end of a conversation about the problem in general, but they understand it. They have a level of acceptance of it, and that deepens connection and intimacy, regardless of whether they end up agreeing or not.
There's some part of people that just doesn't want to overturn what they've previously said. We want to
Mm,
stay
mm,
consistent. So we understand. I mean, I can tell you that if we enter a debate, the person that has to change their opinion or change their view is the one that grew the most.
mm,
But there's also
yes.
this underlying, well, if I was the one that had to change, then what that means is that I was wrong. And if I was
Mm,
wrong, I am somehow less than. So we're very resistant to wanting to change, even when we know logically that if you become aware of something where change is required, like that's like the best case scenario for you, that you now see the world more accurately and that you can change your opinion on this thing and move forward. Like you won the most out of that engagement, but it doesn't feel that way. It feels like
mm.
you lost. And I don't know. It reminds me, I train jujitsu, and you don't often learn a whole lot from the matches you win. But if you
Hmm.
lose, you have the opportunity to learn something in the process.
Yes.
So I don't know. I'm just curious how much of us digging our heels in is really to save face, is really that we just don't want to have to go back on something that we said or to turn that around.
Yeah, I think that that's a big piece of it, Aaron, and just sometimes we just call that stubbornness. From my some of my training, we call that lack of openness for influence,
Mm-hmm.
being closed minded, having a closed mindset instead of a growth mindset. But folks with a growth mindset, um, think about things like failure, in a much different way. And you talked about the jujitsu class, the student that wins, and that's great, but they learn more from their losses than they do their wins. And somebody with a growth mindset's going to be open to being wrong. They're going to be open to failure, and then also look forward to the opportunity to learn from it, even though it might be incredibly painful. Coming to a conclusion, having a sense of that, what, maybe my perspective wasn't exactly the right one, or it certainly wasn't the right one in this family relationship. It's humbling. It requires humility. It's oftentimes painful. And nobody likes to feel pain, of course, but we can learn from that pain. The pain can sprout a sense of growth, in maturity and wisdom. So there's many gifts that come from that humility that's hard to get to because, like you said, we want to save face. We get invested in being right. We then become close to the influence of the other person.
Yeah. And it seems tied to this timeline type of issue of
Mm,
when you say, do you want to be right or do you want resolution?
yes.
Well, if you want resolution and you want a thriving business and you want to see the world as accurately as possible, then you probably need to let go of being right in that one instance,
Yeah.
especially if
Yeah.
if it's preventing you from seeing the possibility of being wrong.
I like that. So I'm aware that we're about we're leaving a little over the time that we normally allot for
Hmm.
these podcasts. There's a part of me that wants to because we've covered half the model, the conflict resolution model. So we set the agenda. We've identified the problem as clearly as possible. We moved then on to good active listening skills, good paraphrase or empathy skills, avoiding interruptions, things like that. We haven't gotten to the bottom three steps in this model yet because you and I, because you brought in some secret sauce of your own, and as well as I have, and so there's much more to talk about. Maybe we make this part one, right, of the podcast, and then follow it up to again go back over the top three steps in the next podcast recording, and then finish it out with the bottom three steps and the rest of the secret sauce that you and I might add.
I think that sounds like a good idea because the what we talked about today is useful heading into the conversation. And
Yes.
but we don't want to just head into the conversation well. We want to actually get down to solving some issues and implementing and getting
Uh,
things to stick. So I think that the conversation next time is it's where everyone needs to be, but the conversation today was all the groundwork that you need to lay in order to get to the
yes.
point where you could have a productive ending of the conflict that we'll talk about next
That
time.
that is well said. I couldn't articulate it any better than that. And in fact, the very next step that we'll get to in our next recording is getting to brainstorming and allowing for once we've established safety, once we've got into the conversation, clarified the problem, and it feels good that we've gotten that far, then we can open our minds to becoming creative. The prefrontal cortex is still engaged, right?
Yep.
And we start to ferret out ideas that could be solutions to the problem that we've been having. Then we get to the implementation of those solutions, and then we follow that meeting up. With a follow up meeting to really then check in about the implementation to see how successful it was, if it needs any tweaking. And so, yeah, I'll look forward to coming back to this topic in our next recording and being able to finish out this 6 step model in a way that gives folks a lot to think about as they try to maybe resolve their own family conflicts.
All right, David, sounds great. I look forward to speaking with you again next time.
As do I, yes.